Next Chapter Podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Trans people are out of the bag, right? Like we're here, and this will get uglier before it gets better. But trans people are not going back to where we were. We're visible. We know we exist now. The reason it seems like there's more trans people is because trans people didn't have the language to describe ourselves. Now we do. Now we're like, oh, I'm not the only one that feels that way. This is actually a thing. This isn't crazy. This isn't magic. It's not make-believe. There are other people like me. And once you know that, there's no going back.
I don't think any of us would have guessed we would have been here right now. I thought we felt like we were moving in the right direction, the complete opposite of where we are now. So it's hard not to see a regression. And it's one of those things of when people feel threatened, they employ all of their tactics. And I think they were threatened. People were threatened by us and about the work we were doing and the fights we were up against. And really just went to very extreme places. And that's what we've seen played out. And it's been working for them, unfortunately.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Hello, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a new South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumoftheNewSouth.org. Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone of the Washington Post, coming to you from the University of Maryland, where I teach, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Green II, a professor of history at Claflin University. Our New South Season 2 explores the complexities of the many New Souths that make up today's New South. The series highlights opportunities and challenges that different communities face, diving into censorship and healthcare, tourism and religion, struggles for rights and resources, and the global reverberations of New South culture.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the show a Signal Award and Anthem Award winner. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South focuses on trans communities in the evolving South. It's a complex subject, and we're really looking forward to having these conversations to understand better the challenges and opportunities trans communities face in the New South. But before we get to our guests, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Green to provide us with some brief insight on the subject.
LGBTQ rights have been on the forefront of American political, cultural, and social discourse since at least the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in New York City. However, when most Americans think of LGBTQ rights, they tend to put the U.S. South on the back burner. There is a fascinating history of LGBTQ life in the U.S. South, and this is doubly true for the trans community in the region, which itself has a long and intriguing history. For example, the project Invisible Histories, created in 2015 by Joshua Burford and Megan Sullivan, is dedicated to collecting artifacts and documents about the rich and varied histories of LGBTQ peoples across the South. In the first decades of the 21st century, trans individuals have become the targets of right-wing political agitation throughout the United States. There has been an intense backlash to the expansion of trans rights in the U.S. South, sometimes with critical economic, social, and political consequences. In 2016, the North Carolina General Assembly passed House Bill 2, the so-called bathroom bill, which prohibited the use of a bathroom by someone of the so-called incorrect biological gender. The bill caused an immediate backlash. Charlotte lost the 2017 NBA All-Star Game, the entire state lost multiple NCAA tournament games, and various corporations threatened to pull out of the state over the bill. North Carolina eventually reversed course on that particular bill, but by 2024, several states, including Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, and yes, North Carolina, had introduced new bills that targeted the trans community. Many of these bills were not just about bathroom access, but were also about trans athletes and which gender they should participate in sports with. Also, numerous southern states have utilized legislation to restrict access to gender-affirming care for trans people. These political fights have become part of a much larger campaign, attempting to roll back the rights of trans and other LGBTQ individuals throughout the nation. The U.S. South, of course, is serving as a key battleground. This means that there are movements on the ground in the region trying to resist and provide an alternative version of what life in the U.S. South should be for trans people and communities. The Campaign for Southern Equality has worked to coordinate efforts across the region to defend trans rights. Groups such as the House of Tulip in New Orleans and the Trans Housing Coalition in Atlanta, among others, have worked to address the chronic problem of lack of housing for trans people, with recent statistics showing that 1 out of every 5 trans people has experienced homelessness in their lives. That reporting is from the National Center for Transgender Equality. In addition, every southern state has several organizations dedicated to these rights. From South Carolina, there is the Harriet Hancock LGBT Center in Columbia, South Carolina. In Georgia, places such as Charis Books and more provide an intellectual and cultural safe haven for trans people. And in North Carolina, the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice has spearheaded grassroots campaigns for human rights and social justice. Pauli Murray's own life is a testament to the importance of understanding trans people and their history. For years, scholars have argued that Murray's life was one of a person who was trans, albeit living in an era of history that lacked the language we have today to describe one's life in that particular manner. Murray's own writings indicate that they, at various times, used he, him, or she, her to describe themselves. And today scholars either use those pronouns or they, them to refer to Murray. Murray, a child of the South, was a fearless leader in the struggle for human rights throughout the 20th century. Now, trans activists have picked up the torch of Southern human rights and self-determination, battling to create a new South welcoming for all.
Our first guest is Errol E.R. Anderson. E.R. is the executive director of Charis, which is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, the South's oldest feminist bookstore, which is in Atlanta, Georgia. ER is the lead facilitator of an adult group called Trans and Friends, co-facilitates the Gender Creative Parenting Collective and the Trans and Queer Teen Group. Our New South welcomes E.R. Anderson.
And we are, again, thrilled to have you on the show today. So could you tell us a bit about yourself, what you do for a living, and what is your relationship to the South?
So, I'm the executive director of an organization called Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We just turned 50 in November, beginning of November. And I am a very proud, lifelong Southerner. specifically a lifelong Atlantan. So I have made the joyful, conscious choice to stay in the South throughout my life. I have studied the South as an academic choice, but also politically, I'm very invested in the South. And so a lot of my work is about helping people sort of, we like to say, like, bloom where they're planted, right? Like encouraging people to stay in the South, invest in the South politically, economically, and not be scared off from staying in the communities where they were born.
Right. That's, I think, a really powerful argument. And as someone who is a native Augustan, I appreciate anybody who is from Atlanta, like much of my family is. But I'm curious, you just said that you are you said you're a native Southerner, then you said you're also native Atlantan. Now, there are some folks in Georgia who would argue that Southerner and Atlantan are two different things. So could you tell us a bit about how being a lifelong Atlantan has influenced your viewpoint on living in the South and what the South can and should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think Atlanta is a unique version of the South, but so is New Orleans, right? So is Miami. So any city in the South is its own unique version of the South. I think Atlanta is, at least in my lifetime as a white Southerner, is unique in that it was, my entire life was majority Black run and led. And so I experienced being a minority in the schools that I grew up in initially, in the neighborhood that I grew up in initially. Most of my life, I did not have the experience that most white people have in this country of feeling like, oh, I'm structurally, everything is geared towards me. Like I went to Battle of the Bands concerts, and like was surrounded by, so many people who were really invested in HBCU culture, right? And all those things, and that was very normalized. I think a lot of that shifted in Atlanta in the last 10 years because Atlanta's been so gentrified. But for me, it was like Atlanta, Black culture was so key to Atlanta, and it was something that really swept up anybody who wanted to be swept up in it. Like I felt very embraced by my peers who were like, yeah, you want to go to this show with me? You want to do this thing with me? Like it was, particularly in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, it was very fun and very positive and people like wanting to build something together. And I think Atlanta, the city too busy to hate stuff is a joke, right? But it's, and it's a lie, but there was an optimism around it in the 90s when I was coming up that did trickle down to young people. And it did feel like people were trying to build things together. I think there's now a cynicism around it because we're like, oh, y'all are a bunch of sellouts building prisons. But when I was a teenager and young adult, it felt like, oh yeah, like we're going to build stuff together. So I think Atlanta's, Atlanta's also the place where people from all over the rural South come if they need a place to be and their hometown won't let them be that. So as a queer person, as a trans person, it's like we are the stop for so many people who either can't stay in their homes or don't feel like they are welcome in their hometown anymore. They come to Atlanta. And so Atlanta is a great place for people to land in a lot of ways.
So ER, the other part of this is the work that you do, particularly around the LGBTQ plus community. You do it, as you well know, in a part of the country that is the most hostile to that group, but at the same time is more populated by LGBTQ plus people than any place else in the country. So I like what you said about not wanting to leave, but wanting to stay and fight all of this. And so how has your upbringing influenced your strength to do the work that you do?
I lead 4 different support groups for trans people. And one of the things that we believe is that all people have a right to be self-determining about their bodies across the spectrum of their life from birth to death. And we look at that as a feminist value, but it's sort of a reproductive justice value. It ties into, it's a racial justice value, right? It's the idea that people deserve to have control over their bodies. That's the reason I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't think that we have a right to control other people's self-determination around what they do with their bodies. And so whether that's abortion or whether that's trans people having access to medical care that is appropriate for them at every age, or whether that's like people having access to, healthy food in their communities, right? It's all tied up for me. And it's very intuitive to me that, like, if you care about people's bodies and you care that they are self-determining, you fight for all these things together. You fight to end the death penalty. You fight, all these things make sense to me as being interrelated. They don't always make sense to other people as being interrelated. A lot of people want to parcel out our fights and say, well, I'm not going to fight for you over here because this takes away my energy or whatever. But so we run these 4 trans groups, and one is for parents of trans kids of any age. So we have, some people are like, well, my kid is 35, but I still need support around this. Some have 3-year-old trans kids. And then we have 2 teen groups for 11 to 18-year-olds. And then we have a 18 and up group. And a lot of folks are from rural parts of Georgia, and they either drive in every day from North Georgia, South Georgia, hours to come to these groups, or we also have an online option for folks. And what we know is that a lot of them are very proud to be Southern and very proud they're holding multiple identities. They're holding their Christianity, they're holding their countryness, they're holding their love for their grandma. They're holding all these things at the same time as they're like, yeah, but I'm trans. Like, what? Like, this is just who I am, and you can preach at me all you want. You can shame me. You can say that I'm going to hell. But at the end of the day, I know who I am, and that's not going to change. No amount of shame is going to change that. And I think no amount of legislation is going to change that. Right now, we're seeing this terrible wave. We've successfully fought some legislation in Georgia. We've unsuccessfully fought other legislation in Georgia. On the national level, we're seeing just really ugly stuff happening right now. And obviously the Supreme Court case is being argued at this moment. And the reality is, like, the culture war has already been lost. Trans people are out of the bag, right? Like, we're here, and this will get uglier before it gets better. But trans people are not going back to where we were. We're visible. We know we exist now. The reason it seems like there's more trans people is because trans people didn't have the language to describe ourselves before now. Now we do. Now we're like, oh, I'm not the only one that feels that way. This is actually a thing. This isn't crazy. This isn't magic. It's not make-believe. There are other people like me. And once you know that, there's no going back. So, I think that's the big thing that we try to help people understand. It's like, yeah, you're not crazy. Like, you are who you are.
And you just mentioned how you lead some of these groups on the ground in Atlanta in terms of fostering conversation amongst trans people in Atlanta and Georgia, more broadly speaking. Could you tell us a bit more about some of the conversations you're having with them? What are they experiencing? First, trans people in Atlanta specifically, and also trans people in rural Georgia as well, because I think for a lot of people, there's an assumption that the South is just one thing, right? It's just one giant rural region. But you just mentioned that there are different experiences just within Georgia alone. So I think that's really interesting and really important for our audience to understand.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are in rural Georgia, even without laws banning, it's very similar to abortion access, right? It's like, even without laws explicitly banning certain kinds of care, there's a sort of quiet quitting among healthcare professionals where they refuse to serve trans patients. And so what we see is trans people are not served with dignity in hospitals, in healthcare settings, in therapy settings. And so they often have to go to major metropolitan places to get care. Now, whether that's Birmingham or Atlanta, the religious freedom stuff in hospitals has really been a challenge because the majority of hospitals in the South have some kind of religious affiliation, whether that's Catholic hospitals or Baptist hospitals. And so the law now allows people to, state their religion prevents them from serving a trans person if that's against their religion, or a gay person, right? It prevents people from participating in an abortion if they do not wish to. And so we are seeing that happening more and more in rural areas. So people are coming to Atlanta, but the Atlanta doctors are oversaturated with clients. And they were able, because of some post-pandemic stuff, able to do more telemedicine. And that was really helpful, right? And ironically, like the pandemic opened up a real opportunity for trans people because more doctors got licensed under telemedicine and they were able to serve people in rural counties and say, okay, you don't have to drive all the way to Atlanta, particularly, a lot of working class folks, they don't have a car, they can't afford to do it. You stay where you are, we can talk on the phone and I can get your prescription called in to your local Walmart. No problem. Well, they're starting to crack down on that. And the Trump administration absolutely wants to crack down on it.
As a person who's a lifelong Southerner and who knows their Southern history as well, where do you see the movement for trans and LGBTQ rights in the broader narrative of Southern history?
Yeah, I mean, they always go for the bathrooms, right? So,
right.
I mean, I'm careful not to extend that metaphor too far, right? I don't want to collapse trans people's experience onto Black folks' experience or enslaved folks' experience. I think we have to be very careful about that. But I do think the legislation is similar, I think in part because federalism, like state by state patchwork laws allow for a great amount of injustice, right? And we are still living in the consequences of the post-Civil War South. I mean, we haven't solved the problems of representation. We haven't solved the problems of the Electoral College. We haven't solved the post-Reconstruction backlash. I mean, this feels to me, I mean, you can learn, obviously, the specifics are very different, but anytime you see a group of people gain some power, cultural power, as with Reconstruction, people began to get a little bit of cultural power, a little bit of political power. There was an immediate, swift, violent backlash from white supremacists. And we get Jim Crow. And so trans people got this cultural power. Queer people got a little bit of cultural power. Like, oh, we're in the movies. We're running, music and this pop culture thing of like, oh, it feels like queer and trans people are everywhere. And that makes me uncomfortable. And so now we're getting this virulent backlash of, no, we're going to strike you down with all of these laws. We're going to control your body. We're going to control your movements. And we're going to make sure that you don't have access to the things that you need to live.
And as someone who serves as executive director of Charis Books, you made the decision to publicly talk about your transition and to make that a public experience for folks. Why was that so important to you in terms of providing an example for others?
Certainly for people who are really, want to medically transition. I do think there are some trans people who choose to be trans because they want to, and that's fine. It wasn't a choice for me. And I also think it's important for young people to see healthy, thriving adult trans people who grew up in the South, who love being in community with all kinds of people, and who aren't going to go back in the closet, So and because I am relatively privileged in that I'm so grounded in community, I'm not going to get fired for being trans. I'm not going to lose my home. I have a partner who loves me, I have parents who love me. I'm the kind of person who should take this risk.
You also, as a Southerner, have witnessed the changes in the South outside of your gender in terms of immigration in the South, which is one thing we've really talked a lot about on this podcast. And when we talk about the idea of the New South on this show, what does that mean to you in that context?
I now live in the suburbs, which I never thought I would. I just moved to the suburbs a year ago, and my 15-year-old self would be so ashamed. But I live in a majority Mexican neighborhood now. And it's amazing to me what the suburbs are like, because the suburbs feel like what Atlanta felt like when I was a kid, because everybody that, moved to the suburbs and the exurbs that, it's like reverse migration, because now the outer ring around Atlanta is really where the majority of working class people move to and where a lot of migrants move to. And so within 2 minutes of my house, there's a Haitian bakery, there's a Vietnamese bakery, there are all these like amazing places that people are gathering. There are like probably 20 different kinds of churches, like different languages spoken at different churches. And it feels like what Atlanta used to, but also much more international than what Atlanta was when I was a kid, right? Atlanta really was black and white, and all of the sort of lenses through which people made decisions were black and white until probably the early 2000s. For me, in my world anyway, I think my version of the New South is just those people of good faith banding together and insisting on our own dignity and saying, like, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't have to live like this, and we refuse to be exploited anymore. So that's my hopeful version of the New South, that I will continue working until it comes to pass.
Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, this was great.
A fantastic conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to meet y'all.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our next guest on this episode of Our New South is Joaquin Carcaño. Carcaño is the Director of Southern Health Policy at the Latino Commission on AIDS. He is a board member of the Southern AIDS Coalition and the ACLU of North Carolina, and the LGBTQ Center of Durham, North Carolina. Previously, Carcaño worked at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill at the Institute for Global Health and Infectious Disease, coordinating medical education and services. Our New South welcomes Joaquin Carcaño.
Joaquin Carcaño, thank you very much for joining. Of course, today I'm talking to you about a critical issue in this country that almost seems to be heavily rooted in the South, which has to do with trans rights in this country. So before we get our conversation started, we always like to have our guests introduce themselves, your name, where you're from, where you're at, and what it is you do.
Thank you, Kevin and Robert. I'm really excited to be here with y'all today and have this conversation. But my name is Joaquin Carcaño, he, him pronouns. I'm originally from the Rio Grande Valley on the Texas-Mexico border. That's where I was born and raised. And now I live in Durham, North Carolina. And I work for the Latino Commission on AIDS and the Latinos in the South program on their policy and advocacy team. And also recently finished nursing school. So I'm also sort of transitioning to a nursing career for 2025. So.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What brought you to Durham, and how long have you been in Durham?
I've been here for about 12 years, and it was my older brother. I sort of followed him here, he followed his now wife here. So we had sort of a trajectory. My little brother's supposed to move here next year. So I guess we have sort of a little migration pattern between Texas and North Carolina. But came to visit. I had been living in Peru with the Peace Corps. Came to visit. I really liked it and was not ready to go back to Texas. Wanted to sort of start a new chapter. And my brother was like, come here. I'm here. We're really close. And I've been here ever since, though his family's now in Georgia and I have no family left in North Carolina, but I found my family here in North Carolina. But that's sort of how I ended up in Durham.
You know, one of the interesting things about the work that you do and who you are is that the South is the most, maybe the most difficult place for the trans community in this country to live. It seems as if it's become, particularly over the last few years, a very hostile environment. on a number of different levels. So why is it that you have come to stay in the South, particularly stay in North Carolina and do the work that you do?
I appreciate this question because I think a lot of both the work I'm a part of and the people who I'm sort of in community with is sort of very committed to combating the ideas of what the South is. I think it's sort of taking back our narrative. But we know that the South has a long history of both Black and Brown communities here, and that's been sort of stripped away from the possibilities, the work invested in this region, and sort of that like clash between the powers that govern the South. But I think there's a lot of real beauty in the South from the people, the places, but I think I think sometimes this word is overused, but the resilience of the people here. But I think there's something about being able to do really incredible, powerful work with much fewer resources. And it does feel like it's always an uphill battle. There's always something around the corner when you think you've had a win and there's something else coming in right around the corner to sort of take that away. But I think being able to really lean into community, because you can't really escape it. And I think there's something about saying, no, you're not going to take this home from us. You're not going to take our community. We have, in some places, generations and generations of our families here that say, you can't take this from us. You can try to drive us out, but this is our home. We deserve to live here. We deserve to work here and build our families here, and build upon legacies of that work that's been invested in this region. And there is beauty for as hard as it can be to live here and work here. And we say, no, this is ours too. And we're going to stand our ground in this way. I think that's really beautiful. And also being able to sort of lean into it. And I love the sort of slower pace of the South. I go to these bigger cities and I'm like, this is overwhelming. Don't put me on a highway. Like subway systems took me a lot to learn, being in New York City a few times. I'm like, this is a lot. But I love sort of that, like, still that sort of porch sitting, let's have a bonfire in the backyard, let's just sit around and talk and scheme, and then we'll go downtown and do something. But I think there's still that sort of like a different way of life here that is really special.
And I think certainly a lot of our listeners would understand that too, especially those who are Southerners. As we were joking earlier, I'm coming to you from what some would consider bad Carolina, but I digress. But Joaquin, we're really happy to have you on the show, in particular to talk about some of these pivotal issues in the South. And one thing that you've worked on a lot is HIV prevention, HIV awareness. Could you talk a bit about your work with that, and in particular, why it's so important for Latino communities in the South to be aware of the issue of HIV?
Definitely. I think both the reasons why I started in HIV are still the reasons why I'm still in it, and the reasons why it's so important that we are talking specifically, I think, about the Latinx community. But back when I was in high school, at this like queer group of friends, one of our friends was diagnosed with HIV, and we're in high school. And we didn't know a lot, it was very hard to find things, there wasn't like these, like, it's sort of in TV shows now in some ways, but it wasn't really framed for us in our community. We're in a poor border community. This is the last thing they're talking about in Texas, where it's conservative, it's heavily Catholic. There's still this, this sense of shame and silence, and it was enough for us to just be out and queer, but to even talk about that was just sort of, that's out of reach. Don't even go there. So when he sort of shared with us in his own way, we sort of rallied around him, but we had a lot of trouble finding resources and conversations, and we had to teach ourselves a lot. And it took him a long time to sort of, I think, grapple with it, and still struggled. And so I think it was so strange to me being, I think we're like 16, trying to find these resources, didn't have adults we could really turn to. Even if we trusted our parents, this was not a conversation we were going to have. But I think that still resonates today. And in a lot of the communities, that I work with, that I'm a part of, and like my work at the commission is about, we need to talk about this. And it's, 20 years and we're still sort of in this place of, we're still not talking about it. There's just such a sense of shame and stigma. And for our Latinx community specifically, there's not a lot that's been framed for our community. And that it's very much this like, just like the homophobia, the conservatism, the sort of like shroud of Catholicism really doesn't allow for a lot of those conversations and to really be honest about who we are, who we're in relationship with. So I think for our community is sort of, it's happening whether we talk about it or not. And I'm committed to that, sparked by my own personal sort of relationship. But along the way, I found in my own community, and HIV does affect, queer community at higher rates. But these are where my people are, whether it's queer folks, trans folks, people who are incarcerated, like these are my people.
Could you talk a little bit about how the South, generally speaking, how difficult it has been over the last 30 years or so to get adequate attention and help for HIV? Because it seems that many Southern states lead the nation in rates of HIV, other STDs and such. What is it about living in the South that contributes to those conditions?
Yeah. I mean, we have the Bible Belt running through the South. I think it's a lot just about education is a big piece of that. Is saying, everything from like, they're not allowing people to even talk about queer people in classrooms now. Not even about HIV, but about about actual identity in classrooms. But growing up, we didn't have this sexual health education. That was unheard of. You watch maybe a movie or something, but we didn't have real sexual health education. I think that's a common theme throughout the South. And that's where it starts, right? But just not properly funding or not having access to funding for health services. Where can youth go to where they can feel safe and they can feel supported for health questions, for sex questions, for relationship questions? The South has to grapple with both the legacy of all the violence that occurred here that continues to inform all the policies of incarceration and violence and anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant stances that all sort of strip away funding that go to community. And we've been deprived of that for, years and years and years, and it just sort of snowballs. So I think that's sort of part of this, like the ugly legacy of the South, on top of like the communities that live here and are building here and who have said these are families, and we're not this ugly narrative of what the South is. So I think that's sort of these contrasting pieces, but that is just like chronic underfunding of community resources, chronic violence against communities, and then sort of when things happen, when we need to seek out support, saying, sorry, we can't grant that to you. This is your own fault. And all of that just compounds and compounds.
Joaquin, one of the reasons we want you on the show is that you are taking a pivotal part in fighting against the current iteration of that discrimination when it comes to trans communities. So you've been involved in a lawsuit against both HB 2 and HB 142, bills out of the State House of North Carolina that discriminate against trans people. Could you talk a bit, number one, about that lawsuit, and number two, in particular, what spurred you to become the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit?
Yeah, and I'll start with the second part because I think that's it's hard to start other places for me personally, but part of it was by chance, and part of it was the relationships that I built through the work I was doing at UNC. And when I was at UNC, I was also doing HIV work for Latinx folks in the state. But the bill had passed, very quickly. ACLU was sort of reaching out to folks on the ground to sort of learn what was happening, how communities were responding, and also looking for plaintiffs. But I received an email because of someone I knew who worked at the UNC LGBTQ Center, who was also fielding some of these questions and inquiries. And I was sent an email saying, hey, they're just looking to talk to people. And I remember they specifically named students, and, I was a staff member, but I was they're looking for trans students and people affected. So I was like, I'm not a student, I'm a staffer, but I'll just reply. It was just like, let me just reply real quick. This is who I am. I'm trans. I work here. If you want to talk, and they responded really quickly. We're like, can we talk to you tonight? Said yes. We had a conversation just about, who I am, what's the work I was doing, and what I was hearing about this law. How was I going to be impacted? How were other people I knew impacted? I think this was like on a Thursday or Friday. And then we continued to have conversations. And I think that like Saturday, they're like, we want you to be the lead plaintiff. So it happened very, very rapidly. When I sent that email, I didn't think I was going to be part of a lawsuit. I didn't think I was going to be sort of this lead plaintiff. So sort of like just this cold email I responded to thinking like, yeah, I'll just offer some insight. And by Monday we filed and we had that big press conference, and it just was a whirlwind. Like thinking back on the day is such a blur and also just so intense. So I think, but it was sort of when they asked me, I was like, I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I'm sort of an introvert. I'm kind of quiet. What am I signing up for? And we didn't know the life it would take and the national spotlight it would have. I think everyone was always so surprised at all the attention it got. I think for good reason, but yeah, I remember standing in that press conference and seeing all these like national TV cameras, and it was like, what did I sign on to? Like, I'm sort of, the team was great and supportive, but it was sort of this, like, I wasn't like, I'm going to be the lead plaintiff and I'm going to go do it. It was just sort of like, if you're asking me, then I'm going to trust why you're asking me and just go with it, which I did. But I think looking back, I think it felt really right. I think it felt, like, Chase was the first person I talked to, from the ACLU. Knowing he was part of the team was really important for me. Having a trans lawyer, because I was like, I don't want to feel tokenized. I don't want to feel manipulated. But having Chase on board really meant a lot to me because I felt immediately I could trust Chase and have continued to throughout the process. But I mean, that lawsuit took years and years. Which is really wild to think about. And I learned a lot about how slow the legal process is, all the sort of like loopholes and like language and just the way it can be sort of weaponized in ways that I had not confronted in this way before. And also navigating sort of the language around the lawsuit and how it sort of like infiltrated all aspects of North Carolina for me and for my community. It was just everywhere.
Do you feel that there has been some regression on the progress that you've made, given that in 2019, the federal courts backed you all up on the so-called bathroom bill?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't want to say it, like there has been regression, but it's hard not to see the losses and see, like, how did we, again, when our lawsuit started, felt like, okay, we're moving in the right direction. I don't think any of us would have guessed we would have been here right now. I thought felt like we were moving in the right direction, the complete opposite of where we are now. So it's hard not to see a regression. So yeah, and I think it's one of those things of when people feel threatened, they employ all of their tactics. And I think they were threatened. People were threatened by us and about the work we were doing and the fights we were up against, and really just went to very extreme places. And that's what we've seen played out. And it's been working for them, unfortunately. But yeah, you see those like anti-trans law tracking maps, and it just... even through 6 months, 6 months ago looked different, or like you see it just expand and expand. So it's, yeah.
Mm.
Oh.
So, Joaquin, you offer a very unique perspective on trans activism, but I'm curious to know what you're seeing on the ground from other trans people in North Carolina in particular. What is it? What are the issues that they face in North Carolina? And I ask this question in part because we've also had on our program a trans activist named Errol who's based in Atlanta. And what they told us was that in Georgia, oftentimes the issues they see from trans folks are trans folks who live in rural Georgia versus trans folks who live in Atlanta or urban Georgia. Are you seeing similar issues in North Carolina where you're seeing different concerns from folks living in rural North Carolina? Or is there, at the very least, a sense of there are unique particular issues that trans folks face on the ground in North Carolina and throughout the South versus the rest of the nation?
I think there's always been sort of that like rural city divide, especially when it comes to accessing any type of healthcare. And like trans healthcare is going to be even like more extreme because of how few providers you have or what's that drive. So I think what I'm hearing from people in more rural areas is sort of, well, we've been making these treks for a while, or we've been doing that. I think there's like both like a sense of fear. Probably the fear is stronger in some of the cities in terms of like access to care, because it's been more accessible. So it feels like we've been able to access it at a different level than some folks in rural areas. So it feels harder to think about not having that when we've built up so many things to get that access.
Which leads us to another question we ask everyone about, and that's this idea of the New South. And when we started talking, you spoke very lovingly of the South and being in Durham and how warm it is. And now you're talking about immigration in the South beyond your community and how that has strengthened you in numbers as well as in cross-cultural relationships. So what in your mind is, first of all, is the South, since you come from Texas, from the Valley, and now you're in North Carolina and you are there with more of your family, inviting more of your family. What is it about the South that has so comforted you to make it home?
Some of it is, it's like the South can be that family member that maybe when you're alone, like you're in your family gathering, you don't always get along with. But if you go anywhere else, you're like, don't you dare talk to my family member that way. I think it's kind of like that, this is family bonding. I think the South can kind of be like that. Like, we know our problems, we know our issues. It's far from perfect. We don't have to travel far from Durham to not feel safe. And things like that. And that goes for a lot of places too, not just the South. But I think there is this like inherent protective, piece of us that who are like have lived here, who were born here, who found a home here. They're like, don't take the South. Like, you don't know. And I think that's a part of it. And like having something to fight for is always kind of motivating and energizing. I think there's a lot to fight for as hard as it can be. But I think, the South has some of the best food, even if we all will argue about who has the best barbecue or anything like that.
Well, you almost ventured into a barbecue war there, because I saw
I know.
his visceral reaction to to your promoting North Carolina barbecue.
I just said barbecue because I'm from Texas, so that's
my reaction was more based around the fact that I knew it was coming sooner or later. That you cannot have somebody who lives in Texas and North Carolina not at some point talk about barbecue. That was inevitable.
I love some pulled pork, but I also love my brisket. And North Carolina can't do a Texas brisket or like their own brisket. It's just not. I'm sorry. It's true. I'll give credit where it's due. Your North Carolina can have the pulled pork and the hush puppies. There's a lot of fights to be had. They can all be justified in their own ways. I won't get into it, but I think from like so much of the origins of like what people have found to love about this country, for as much as of its flaws can be found in the South, but I think that's like food, that's music, that's people, it's culture, that's arts. And I think it is about like, don't take this home from us. Like, people have both forced people to be here, have pushed people out, saying like, you're not going to take it from us. Either you force people to come here, or you said it didn't belong to us, even if we love it, even if we have found family here. You can't take that. Like, that is our choice. And it's just, I think there is that, like, there's beauty to that sort of, you don't know what it is here. And so you're not going to take it from us.
What you just said reminds me of the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1967 gave a sermon called Why Jesus Called a Man a Fool, where he talks about his grandparents and great-grandparents being buried in the soil of the South, and how as much as the South has done him and his people wrong, he can't leave it behind. It's still his home, no matter what. And you just articulated the very same thing. And to that end, I'm curious as to what are some current efforts that you're aware of that are underway across the South to fight back against this spate of anti-LGBTQ legislation that's coming out of various southern state legislatures?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like national and regional groups that have done a lot of mobilizing. So there's everyone from like the Transgender Law Center to the Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement. We do a lot of work with them. One of their main organizers also in North Carolina. And so, ACLU, Lambda Legal on the policy side are leading a lot of the sort of lawsuits and sort of countering the policy efforts. And I think there's like the community work, sort of institutional work, and then there's like the high level like policy advocacy. So like ACLU, Lambda Legal, and like Transgender Law Center like filters between that. I think groups like Familia, and I like our organization, Latinos in the South and Latino Commission are also that institutional and sort of grassroots. But I think a lot of the, Tent in Texas does a lot of incredible work. There's Q Latinx in Orlando, who was founded after the Pulse shooting and does a lot of work in Florida. Those are partners of ours. Or AIDS Alabama, Campaign for Southern Equality does a lot of both community grassroots work and has done a lot of rapid response funding for families that are moving, who have been forced to move out of the South or need support being in the South. So I think we need people at all levels. And I think that's the way we can continue to mobilize and say, like, we have all these strengths. We have a role to play. That's something I really try to emphasize. We all have a role to play, whether it's media, that's fundraising, that's, advocacy. But I think there's a piece for everybody to plug in. And I think that's we'll find a way.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic.
Yeah. Man, thanks. This is great. What struck me the most, Robert, about this episode was that both of our guests, despite being trans, are living in the most hostile region in this country for trans people. They're not leaving. They've decided to find their own comfort within that region, and they're doing so almost in the spirit of marginalized people throughout the South over the years, and how they have fought for their right to be comfortable where they live.
I think it's remarkable how both E.R. Anderson and Joaquin Carcaño were insistent on how even within the South, trans people face unique challenges. Number one, if you're living in an urban center like Charlotte or Atlanta, you have access to certain resources and certain networks that you may not have access to if you live in the rural South. Mm-hmm. But they were both also insistent, again, going back to your point about not leaving the South, of saying that they both love the South. They love the region, they love the hospitality, the food, the weather. There's so much about the current South that they love, which is what makes their struggle all the more impressive. All they're simply saying is, we want to be included. And in fact, what they're both saying is, we want to make the South an even better place for everyone to live in.
Exactly. And as we've always said in this show, we've always observed in this show, that translates to the rest of the country. So how they are able to survive and thrive means so much for the rest of the trans community throughout the country.
And, really thinking about how marginalized communities try to transform the South, our next episode is actually about immigrants to the New South and how they're trying to change the region to be a more diverse, welcoming place as well.
And not only are they changing the region to be more welcoming, but they're also changing politics, because we're going to be talking to two members of immigrant communities who have been elected to office, and not necessarily just by immigrants like themselves.
And what's really intriguing about that is how both of these politicians / immigrants are really talking about their version of the American dream, which in many ways is also a version of a dream of a new South. So I'm really looking forward to our next episode.
Absolutely. I wouldn't miss it.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofenewsouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to editor and sound designer Kyle Murdoch, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Piñeres, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frankie Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
Thanks for listening.
The South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.